What's going on, Geminites? It's your boy Gem Mint. You're back at Gem Mint Collectibles with another recent reads. This time we're going to talk about Absolute Preacher, all 3 volumes. Just got done reading it. Crazy good book. Stay tuned for the review and an overlook of the books because the books are probably the most impressive hardcovers out. Stay tuned. Go, rush. Alright, y'all, thanks for coming back. Just got done reading Absolute Preacher. Before I even go into the recent reads or the story, I want to talk about the actual Absolute editions. The Preacher Absolute was actually the first time I've read Preacher and the first Absolute edition that I've ever owned. So it was 2 new things for me, and they were both out of this world, man. The Absolutes have these slipcases with awesome artwork by Glenn Farby, who did all the covers for the Preacher individual issues, which are in oversized format inside of the book. Steve Dillon is responsible for the artwork on the interiors, and of course it was written by Garth Ennis. But as you can see on the slipcase, just very well detailed, very well put together, huge art on both sides, and nice spines that go with each other. The actual hardcovers themselves are impressive. It almost feels like you're reading something holy, man. It's like this leather wrap with this gold embossed font and graphics on the spine, and it really makes you feel like you're reading something important, even though the story itself could be really raunchy and inappropriate. It almost feels like you're holding like a Bible or something. Very well constructed. The slipcases, the actual hardcover books, the binding, the ribbon for the bookmark that's in each volume, and the paper quality, high gloss, thick stock paper. You get all 66 issues of Preacher, the Saint of Killers miniseries 1 through 4, and then you get 5 Preacher one shots. So you're getting like 75 issues in this run. The Absolute editions have about 25 issues in each. The first Absolute has 1 through 26. The second Absolute has 27 through 40, plus the 4-part miniseries for the Saint of Killers, and then the 5 one-shots, which is the story of You Know Who, The Good Old Boys, Cassidy, Blood and Whiskey, and One Man's War. And then the third volume has 41 through 66. So these 3 volumes contain the entire Preacher run. They have a cover price of $150. I got them all for about $75 on InStockTrades.com, where I get all my new hardcovers and collected editions for free shipping and all that. I'm going to need a check from y'all, man. It's all this free publicity. So Preacher's written by Garth Ennis. Garth Ennis can be very funny, very exaggerated, and some of the subplots could just be downright crazy. We may get into spoiler territory here. If you don't want to be spoiled on Preacher because you intend to read it, you might not want to watch this right now because I might slip up and say some things. But for an example, one of the main characters, Cassidy, which is a vampire who's an alcoholic, a drug addict, and he ends up going down on a guy for heroin. Like, it's that kind of shit, right? So the Preacher is our main guy, Jesse Cluster. He is a preacher, but he's not like a preacher like you would think, right? He's a Texas boy. He could whoop anyone's ass. He's like a cowboy, really. He had a crazy hard upbringing, almost in like a den of thieves type of surroundings where killing is not only accepted, but it's a way of life. He was taught how to fight. He was taught how to be a man. And he's basically an outlaw that becomes a preacher to try to do the right thing. He doesn't ever really successfully be a preacher. He doesn't preacher very well in this issue, but he's trying to do the right thing. He's got a girlfriend, Tulip. They ended up developing her character a lot and making her a badass chick, but at first I didn't really get that vibe from her. Now keep in mind, I read Volume 1 last year. Volume 2 I read about 6 months ago when it came out. And I just got finished reading Volume 3, so I'm going to try to think this through with y'all. So you got Jesse, you got Tulip, you got Cassidy, like I mentioned, who is a vampire. He's got the strength of about 50 men. He really can't be hurt. I mean, you can like tear him up, rip body parts off him, and they'll eventually grow back. He just can't go out in the sun and stay out for too long because he'll spontaneously combust. But he'll suck blood to get energy. But really, his whole thing is that he's like a British guy, and he's big into drinking, whoring, doing drugs. What Ennis does pretty well is he writes how they speak. So Cassidy's dialogue will have a lot of heavy British slang and accents and the way that he spells words. Then when you go to Jesse Cluster, the preacher's imaginary friend, which is John Wayne, his dialogue is written in like a real thick Texas slang. Then you have one of the other main characters, Arseface, who tries to shoot himself Kurt Cobain style with a shotgun, but he survives, and he has to get his face surgically reconstructed, but it looks like an asshole. But he's called Arseface. And his dialogue is all woo, 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 woo. And that's how it is. And you kind of got to try to make it out. Later on in the series, they give him subtitles, like in the last couple of issues. I guess because it mattered what he said. You got the Saint of Killers, which reminds me very much like... I haven't watched or read The Dark Tower, but he reminds me of that. Like this supernatural gunslinger being. His miniseries was crazy. He basically was a human in the Western times where you had to like walk for 3 days to get somewhere in the desert, and his family basically gets murdered, and he has so much hate in him and so much rage that he becomes this Saint of Killers, this unstoppable gunslinging force who plays a big role at the end of the story. And then you got Air Star, which is like your bad guy, your Nazi type of Hitler-esque type of character who is trying to bring forth Armageddon because he is aware of the overarching story. So let's get into that. The overarching story is that God has left heaven. He walked out on the job. He no longer wants the role. God is missing. We also find out that there's this being called Genesis, which was conceived from by an angel and a demon, having a child, conceiving this being Genesis, which is potentially more powerful than God. We see the conception too in one of the earlier issues, and I was like, holy shit, that was crazy. Jesse gets invoked with this being Genesis, and it gives him the word of God. So if he gets pissed and tells somebody to do something, his eyes get red, the text gets read, and they will literally do whatever he says. He condemns one guy to counting 3 million grains of sand on the beach, which takes him like 5 years and drives him insane. Aristar works for this organization called the Grail, and like I said, they're trying to bring on Armageddon. Jesse gets tasked on this mission to find God, and it becomes very personal for him, where he wants to find him and make him answer for all the shit that he's done or hasn't done, right? And as the story progresses, we find out more and more of what has gone on behind the curtain. We find out that God created mankind because he has a need to be loved. So he creates these beings so that they'll love him. His leaving heaven caused a civil war between the angels. They call it the fall, where basically half of them get killed. But it was just a way for him to see whose side which angel would go with. And they kind of make him out to be egotistical. So it's kind of deep in that sense, but at the same time it's very street level. You have that overarching story, which is boom, God, angels, demons. And then you have these side stories with Jesse and his upbringing and his crazy grandma in a wheelchair that's got like missing limbs and ordering hits and shit like that. And then Cassidy as this vampire that's been around for centuries that is really a piece of shit. And the crazy stuff that happens just along the way. Arseface ends up becoming a rock star, and he's on top of the world, and everybody... a bunch of kids start trying to mutilate themselves to look like him, and then he rises and falls as his manager keeps pushing the envelope on saying shit for him that eventually leads to everybody hating him. You know what? It kind of plays out a lot like the movie Dogma, where Jesse even runs into these rogue angels in a motel, and they're like just doing whatever, man. No one's watching heaven. They're trying to make it seem like everything's still all good when it ain't. They even have a phone where you can call heaven, and it gets very Dogma, where it's like realistic situations, but it's like really far out there, you know. So basically, on this journey, you have a lot of ups and downs with the friendship between Jesse and Cassidy. They're really best buds, but then you kind of see Cassidy's really plotting on his girl Tulip. There's a point where Jesse dies, or they think he's dead, and then they hook up, but really Cassidy just is keeping her intoxicated for 6 months, and that kind of causes a real problem for Jesse when he sees them together. Jesse does end up finding God. You do see God a few times throughout the storyline, which is pretty crazy, and the way that he talks to him is crazy. So, you know, somebody asked me on Facebook, they were like, listen, I'm a pretty religious guy. Is it like, should I read this? I mean, is it blasphemous? And I don't know. You know, I try to tell him I'm not the most religious guy, but I wouldn't read some outright disrespectful shit. You know, I thought it was just a crazy story. I don't think they really, they kind of pushed it a little bit at the end when they were, you know, talking about God's intentions. But I think it was okay to read. I mean, really, that's the part of the story that's not the craziest. I think the sex and the violence and the drugs is way out there. So if you're not into that type of shit, you're not going to like this story. The religious aspect of the book is just the undertone and the overall story. But the majority of the issues deal with the small interactions between Jesse, Cassidy, Tulip, Airstar, Arseface, and the Saint of Killers. Really well written. I'm not really a big fan of Steve Dillon. This is his best work. Garth Ennis, I've read other stuff from Garth Ennis, like The Boys and his Punisher run, not the Marvel Max, but the regular Punisher run. And it's very much like those stories. Even Jesse Custer's grandmother is very similar to the Mafia wife. The Mafia wife in the Punisher run, who's in a wheelchair as well. They're very similar, but I think this is Ennis at his best. It's definitely Steve Dillon at his best. A crazy type of story, which ends with a confrontation between God and Jesse. God explains his reasons. Jesse basically sets up a plot to have the Saint of Killers go to heaven, await God's throne. The only way to kill God is in heaven, and he can't be on his throne. So the Saint of Killers kills God. And they say he's the world that God created has outgrown him and doesn't need him anymore, basically, in the story, right? So it's pretty heavy, but like I said, most of the time you're laughing and you're like a lot of shock factor and what's going on besides that overarching story. I loved it. It was the first time I read Preacher. It really set the bar for Absolute editions for me. The only other Absolute series that comes close to quality like this is the Sandman run, which is equally intense as a story with just as good characters. I definitely love reading Preacher. I would read it again one day. It was a pretty quick read. If you've read the run, let me know what you thought in the comments. What did you like about it? What did you dislike? Some favorite parts, favorite moments. But that's my recent reads on The Preacher. I loved it. If you're new to the channel, this is one of the segments we do. We do a recent reads, but we do a lot of other stuff with statue unboxing and reviews. We do a lot of hauls. We do a lot of collection, like every Green Lantern Absolute edition released so far. We do a live show Sundays, and we have a Facebook page, but we just recently turned it into a Facebook group called Geminites. So go on and join the Geminites Facebook group. We created that so people can have a forum to ask questions and post things related to the channel. And, you know, I don't have to be responsible for answering. The community can help out and point people in the right direction and just interact with each other. So we had like 325 members so far. So let's grow that Facebook group and get the Gem Army strong. Thanks for checking it out. Stay minty. Peace.